The world's great short stories. By transcription, the University of the Air presents Wine on the Desert by Max Brand, a story of horrible revenge on the sun-baked desert.
Durant had been able to see the wheel and the fan of Tony's windmill for more than an hour, but he could not make out the 10 acres of the vineyard until he had topped the last rise, where the vines had been planted in a hollow. The lowness of the ground, Tony used to say, accounted for the water that gathered in the well during the wet season. The rains sank through the desert sand, through the gravels beneath, and gathered in a bowl of clay hardpan far below. In the middle of the rainless season, the well ran dry, but long before that, Tony had every drop of the water pumped into a score of tanks made of cheap corrugated iron. Slender pipelines carried the water from the tanks to the vines, and from time to time let them sip enough life to keep them until the winter darkened overhead, and suddenly, one November day, the rains would come, and all the earth made a great hushing sound as it drank. Durant had heard that whisper of drinking when he was here before, but he had never seen the place in the middle of a long drought. Durant rode up to the squat adobe hut and right through the entrance into the patio. A flowering vine clothed 3 sides of the little court. Durant did not know the name of the plant, but it had large white blossoms with golden hearts that poured sweetness out into the air. Durant hated the sweetness. It made him more thirsty. He threw the reins of his mule and strode into the house. The water cooler stood in the hall outside the kitchen. There were 2 jars made of porous stone, very ancient things, and the liquid which distilled through the pores kept the contents cool. The jar on the left held water. That on the right contained wine. There was a big tin dipper hanging on a peg beside each jar. Durant tossed off the cover of the vase on the left and plunged in it until the delicious coolness closed well above his wrists. "Hey, Tony!" Out of his dusty throat, the cry was a mere groaning. He drank and called again clearly, "Tony!" A voice pealed from the distance. Durant, pouring down the second dipper of water, smelled the alkali dust which had shaken off his clothes. He heard the wooden leg of Tony bumping on the ground, and Durant grinned. Then Tony came in with that hitch and side swing which he accommodated the stiffness of his artificial leg. His brown face shone with sweat as though a special ray of light were focused on it. "Oh, hello, Dick," he said. "Good old Dick. How long since you come last?" Durant grinned and said, "You wouldn't throw some water into that mule of mine, would you, Tony?" Tony went out with his wooden leg clumping loud on the wooden floor, softly in the patio dust. Durant found the hammock in the corner of the patio and lay down on it and watched the color of the sunset flush the mists of desert dust that rose to the zenith. The water was soaking through his body, and hunger began. Then the rattling of pans in the kitchen and the cheerful cry of Tony's voice, "What you want, Dick? I got a pork. You want the pork? I'll make you some good Mexican beans, huh?" "I know, old Dick. I have plenty good wine for you, Dick." "Tortillas?" "Now, what about a nice young rabbit?" "Oh, blowed full of buckshot, I suppose," growled Durant. No, I kills him with a rifle." "You kill rabbits with a rifle?" repeated Durant with quick interest. "It's the only gun I got," said Tony. "If I catch them in the sights, they're dead. A wooden leg cannot walk very far. I must kill them quick, you see. They come close to the house. I flop their ears. I shoot through the head." "Huh?" "Yeah," muttered Durant. "Through the head." He relaxed, scowling, and passed his hand over his face. After supper, Durant asked, "Whatever happened to your father?" Tony lifted his hand as though he were listening, or as though he were pointing out a thought. "The desert killed him. I found his mule. It was dead, too. There was a leak in the canteen. My father was only 5 miles away when the buzzards showed him to me." "5 miles? Just an hour away?" said Durant. He stared with big eyes. "Just dropped down and died?" "No," said Tony. "When you die of thirst, you always die just one way. First, you tear off your shirt. Then your undershirt. That's to be cooler. And the sun comes and cooks your bare skin, and then you think, there's water everywhere, and if you dig down far enough, then you begin to dig. The dust comes up to your nose, and you start screaming. You break your nails in the sand. You wear the flesh off the tips of your fingers to the bone. Tony took a quick swallow of wine. Unless you've seen a man die of thirst, how do you know they start screaming? Because they got that screaming look when you find them, said Tony. Here, take some more wine. The desert never gets you here. My father showed me the way to keep the desert away from this hollow. We live pretty good here. Yeah, said Durant, loosening his shirt collar. Yeah, you live pretty good here. Afterward, Durant slept well in the hammock until the report of a rifle waked him. He saw the color of dawn in the sky. It was such a great round bowl that for a moment he felt as though he were above, looking down into it. He got up and saw Tony coming in holding a rabbit by the ears, the rifle in his other hand. You see, said Tony, breakfast came and called on us. He laughed. Durante examined the rabbit. Nice and fat, and had been shot through the head, through the middle of the head. Such a shudder went down the back of Durant that he washed gingerly before breakfast. He felt that his blood was cooled for the entire day. It was a good breakfast, flapjack, stewed rabbit, green peppers, and a quart of strong coffee. Before they'd finished, the sun struck through the east window and started them sweating. Give me a look at that rifle of yours, Tony, will you? Oh, you takes a look at the rifle, but don't you steal the lockets in it. He brought the 15-shot Winchester and gave it to Durant. Loaded right to the brim? Asked Durant. I always load it full the minute I get home. Tony, come outside with me. And they went out of the house. The sun turned the sweat of Durant to hot water and then dried his skin so that his clothes felt transparent. Tony, I'm going to be mean, said Durant. You stand right there where I can see you. Now, don't try to get too close. Now, listen. The sheriff's going to be along this trail sometime today looking for me. He'll load up himself and his gang with water out of your tanks. Then he'll follow my signs across the desert. He'll follow if he finds water on this place. He isn't going to find any water. What have you done, poor Dick? Now, look, I hide you in the old wine cellar. Nobody finds you there. The sheriff's not going to find any water. It's going to be like this. He put the rifle to his shoulder, aimed, and fired. The shot struck the base of the nearest tank, ranging down through the bottom. A semicircle of darkness began to stain the soil near the edge of the iron wall. Tony fell down on his knees. No, Dick. No, good, Dick. Look, all the vineyard. It'll die. It will turn into old dead wood, Dick. Shut your face, said Durant. No, I started a kind of anarchist job. Tony fell on his face and put his hands over his ears. Durant drilled a bullet hole through the tanks, one after another. Afterward, he leaned on the rifle. Take my canteen and go in and fill it up with water from that cooling jar. Come on, snap into it, Tony. Tony got up. He raised the canteen and looked around him. Not at the tanks, from which the water was pouring so that the noise of the earth drinking was audible, but at the rows of his vineyard. Then Tony went into the house. Durant mounted his mule and shifted the rifle to his left hand and drew out his heavy Colt from the revolver. Tony came dragging back to him, his head down. Durant watched Tony with a careful revolver, but he gave up the canteen without lifting his eyes off the ground. The trouble with you, Tony, is that you're yellow. I'd have fought a tribe of wildcats with my bare hands before I'd let them do what I'm doing to you. But you sit back and take it. Tony did not seem to hear. He stretched out his hands to the vines. Oh, my God. Will you let them all die? Durant shrugged his shoulders, shook the canteen to make sure that it was full, so brimming that there was hardly room for the liquid to make a sloshing sound. Then he turned the mule and kicked it into a dog trot. Half a mile from the house of Tony, he threw the empty rifle to the ground. No sense packing that useless weight. Tony, with his pegged leg, could hardly come that far. Durant looked back a mile or so later and saw the little image of Tony picking up the rifle from the dust, then staring earnestly after his guest. Durant remembered the neat little hole clipped through the head of the rabbit. Wherever he went, his trail could never return again to the vineyard in the desert. But then, commencing to picture to himself the arrival of the sweating sheriff and his posse at the house of Tony, Durant laughed heartily. The sheriff's posse could get plenty of wine, of course, but without water, a man could not hope to make the desert voyage, even with a mule or a horse to help him. Durant patted the full, rounding side of his canteen. He might even now begin with the first sip, but it was a luxury to postpone pleasure until desires become greater. He raised his eyes along the trail. Close by, it was merely dotted with occasional bones. But distance joined the dots into an unbroken chalk line which wavered with a strange leisure across the Apache desert, pointing toward the cool blue promise of the mountains. The next morning, he'd be among those mountains. A coyote whisked out of a gully and ran like a gray puff of dust on the wind. His tongue hung out like a little red rag from the side of his mouth. And suddenly, Durant was dry to the marrow. He uncorked and lifted his canteen. It had a slightly sour smell. Perhaps the sacking which covered it had grown a trifle old. And then he poured a great mouthful of lukewarm liquid. He swallowed it before his senses could give him warning. It was wine. He looked first of all toward the mountains. They were as calmly blue, as distant as when he had started that morning. 24 hours not on water, but on wine. I deserve it. I trusted him to fill the canteen, and I deserve it. With a mighty resolution, he quieted the panic in his soul. He would not touch the stuff till noon. Then he would take one discreet sip. He would win through. Hours went by. He looked at his watch. Only 10 o'clock. He thought it was on the verge of noon. He uncorked the wine and drank freely, and corking the canteen felt almost as though he needed a drink of water more than before. He sloshed the contents of the canteen. Already it was light. Once he turned the mule and considered the return trip. But he could remember the head of the rabbit too clearly drilled through the center. The vineyard. The rows of old, twisted, gnarled little trunks with the bark peeling off. Every vine was to Tony like a human life, and Durant had condemned them all to death. He faced the blue of the mountains again. His heart raced in his breast with terror. Perhaps it was fear, and not the suction of that dry and deadly air that made his tongue cleave to the roof of his mouth. The day grew older. Nausea began to work in his stomach. Nausea alternated with sharp pains. When he looked down, he saw that there was blood on his boots. He'd been spurring the mule until the red ran down from its flanks. It went with a curious stagger like a rocking horse with a broken rocker. And Durant grew aware that he had been keeping the mule at a gallop for a long time. He pulled it to a halt. It stood with wide-braced legs, head down. When Durant leaned from the saddle, he saw that its mouth was open. It's going to die. It's going to die. What a fool I've been. The mule did not die until after sunset. Durant left everything except his revolver. He packed the weight of that for an hour and discarded it in turn. His knees were growing weak. When he looked up at the stars, they shone white and clear for a moment only, and then whirled into little racing circles and scrawls of red. He lay down. He kept his eyes closed and waited for the shaking to go out of his body, but it would not stop. And every breath of darkness was like an inhalation of black dust. He got up and went on, staggering. Sometimes he found himself running. Before you die of thirst, you go mad. He kept remembering that. His tongue had swollen big. Before it choked him, if he lanced it with his knife, the blood would help him. He'd be able to swallow. Then he remembered that the taste of blood is salty. Once in his boyhood, he had ridden through a pass with his father. They'd looked down on the sapphire of a mountain lake, 100,000 million tons of water, cold as snow. When he looked up now, there were no stars, and this frightened him. He never had seen a desert so dark. His eyes were failing. He was blinded. When the morning came, he would not be able to see the mountains, and he'd walk around and around in a circle until he dropped and died. No stars, no wind. The air as still as the waters of a stale pool, and he in the dregs of the bottom. He seized his shirt at the throat and tore it away so that it hung in 2 rags from his hips. He could see the earth only well enough to stumble on the rocks, but there were no stars in the heavens. He was blind. He had no more hope than a rat in a well. But Italian devils know how to put poison in wine that will steal all the senses, or any one of them, and Tony had chosen to blind Durant. He heard a sound like water. The swishing of soft, deep sand through which he was treading. Sand so soft that a man could dig it away with his own bare hands.
By transcription, the University of the Air has just presented Wine on the Desert by Max Brand.
Choice.